Darkly Dreaming Dexter, Chapter 22. Police politics, as I had tried so hard to impress on Deborah, was a slippery and many-tentacled thing. And when you brought together two law enforcement organizations that didn't really care for each other, mutual operations tended to go very slowly, much very by the book, and with a good deal of foot-dragging, excuse-making, and veiled insults and threats. All great fun to watch, of course, but it did draw out the proceedings just a trifle more than necessary. Consequently, it was several hours after Steban's dreadful yodeling exhibition before the jurisdiction squabbling had straightened out and our team actually began to examine the happy little surprise our new friend Steban had discovered when he had opened the door. During that time, Deborah stood off to one side for the most part, working very hard at controlling her impatience, but not terribly hard at hiding it. Captain Matthews arrived with Detective LaGuardia in tow. They shook hands with their Broward County counterparts, Captain Moon and Detective McClellan. There were a lot of barely polite sparring, which boiled down to this. Matthews was reasonably certain that the discovery of 6 arms and 6 legs in Broward was a part of his department's investigation of 3 heads lacking the same pieces in Miami-Dade. He stated, in terms that were far too friendly and simple, that it seemed a bit far-fetched to think that he would find 3 heads without bodies and then 3 totally different bodies without heads would turn up here. Moon and McClellan, with equal logic, pointed out that people found heads in Miami all the time, with equal logic. They took it a bit more seriously, and anyways, there was no way to know for sure how they were connected until some preliminary work had been done, which clearly ought to be done by them, since it was in their jurisdiction. Of course, they would cheerfully pass on the results. And of course, that was unacceptable to Matthews. He explained carefully that the Broward people didn't know what to look for and might miss something, or destroy a piece of key evidence. Not, of course, though incompetence or stupidity, Matthews was quite sure the Broward people were perfectly competent, considering. This was naturally not taken into a cheerful spirit of cooperation by Moon, who observed with a little bit of feeling that this seemed to imply that his department was to reply too much too politely. Oh no, not second-rate at all. I'm sure it would have ended in a fist fight if the gentleman from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement had not arrived to referee. The FDLE is a sort of state-level FBI. They have jurisdiction anywhere in the state at any time, and unlike the feds, they are respected by most local cops. The officer in question was a man of average height and build with a shaved head and a closed, cropped beard. He didn't really seem out of the ordinary to me, but when he stepped between the 2 much larger police captains, they instantly shut up and took a step back. In short order, he had things settled down and organized and got quickly back to being neat and well-ordered, a scene of a multiple homicide. The man from the FDLE had ruled that it was Miami-Dade's investigation until tissue samples proved that the body parts here and the heads down there were related. In practical and immediate terms, this meant that Captain Matthews got to have his picture taken by the first of the mob of reporters already clustering outside. Angel No Relation arrived and went to work. I was not at all sure what to make of it, and I don't mean jurisdictional squabbling, no. I was far more concerned with the event itself, which had left me with a great deal to think about. Not merely the fact of the killings, but the redistribution of the meat, which was piquant enough. But I had, of course, managed to sneak a peek into Steban's little closet of horrors earlier, before the troops arrived. Can you blame me? Really? I had only wanted a sample of the carnage and try to understand why my dear unknown business associate had chosen to stack the leftovers there. Truly, just a quick look-see. So immediately after Saban had skidded out the door, squealing and grunting like a pig choking on a grapefruit, I had skipped eagerly back to the closet to see what had set him off. The parts were not wrapped carefully this time. Instead, they were laid out on the floor in 4 groups. And as I looked closer, I realized a wonderful thing. One leg had been straight along the left-hand side of the closet. It was pale, bloodless, blue-white, and around the ankle there was even a small gold chain with a heart-shaped trinket. Very cute, really, unspoiled by awful bloodstains. Truly elegant work. 2 dark arms, equally well-cut, had been placed, bent at the elbow, and placed alongside the leg, with the elbow pointing away. Right next to this, the remaining limbs, all bent at the joint, had been arranged in 2 large circles. It took me a moment. I blinked, and suddenly it swam into focus, and I had to frown very hard to keep myself from giggling out loud like a schoolgirl. Deb had accused me of being... Get it together, Dexter. Because he had arranged the arms and legs in letters, and the letters spelled out a single small word. Boo. The 3 torsos were carefully arranged below the boo in a quarter circle, making up a cute little Halloween smile. What a scamp. But even as I admired the playful spirit and the prank that this exposed, I wondered why he had chosen to put it display here in a closet instead of out on the ice where it could gain the recognition of a wider audience. It was a very spacious closet, granted, but still close quarters. Just enough room for the displays. So why? And as I wonder, the outer door of the arena swung open with a clatter, the first of the arriving crew, rescue team no doubt, and the door crashing wide sent a moment later a draft of cool air over the ice and onto my back. The cold air went over my spine and was answered by a flow of warmth, moving upward along the same pathway. It ran light-fingered up into the unlit bottom of my unconsciousness, and something changed somewhere deep in the moonless night of my lizard brain, and I felt the dark passenger agree violently with something that I did not even hear or understand, except that it had to do somehow with the primal urgency of cool air, and the walls closing in, and an attacking sense of rightness. No question about it. Something here was just plain right and made my obscure hitchhiker pleased and excited and satisfied in a way I did not begin to understand. And floating in above all that was the strange notion that this was very familiar. None of it made any sense to me, but there it was. And before I could explore these strange revelations any further, I was being urged by a squat young man in blue uniform to step away and keep my hands in plain sight. No doubt he was the very first of the arriving troops, and he was holding his weapon on me in a very convincing way. Since he had only one dark eyebrow running along the way across his face and no apparent forehead, I decided it would be a very good idea to go along with his wishes. He looked to be just the sort of dull-witted brute who might shoot an innocent person, or even me. I stepped away from the closet. Unfortunately, my retreat revealed the little diorama in the closet, and the young man was suddenly very busy finding some place to put his breakfast. He made it to a large trash can about 10 feet away before commencing his ugly blarging sounds. I stood quite still and waited for him to finish. Nasty habit, hurling half-digested food around like that. So unsanitary. And this was a guardian of public safety, too. More uniforms trotted in, and so soon my simian friend had several buddies sharing the trash can with him. The noise was extremely unpleasant, to say nothing of the smell now wafting my way. But I waited politely for them to finish, since one of the fascinating things about a handgun is that it can be fired almost as well as by someone who is throwing up. But one of the uniforms eventually straightened up, wiped his face on his sleeve, and began to question me. I was soon sorted out and pushed over to one side with instructions not to go anywhere or to touch anything. Captain Matthews and Detective LaGuardia had arrived soon after, and when they finally took over the scene, I had relaxed a bit. But now I could actually go somewhere and touch something. I simply sat and thought, and the things I thought were surprisingly troublesome. Why had he displayed it in the closet? Why did that display seem familiar? Unless I was going to return to my idiocracy of earlier in the day and persuade myself in the thought that I had done this, I was at a loss as to why it should seem so delightfully unsurprising. Of course, I hadn't done it. I was already ashamed of the stupidity that I felt of that notion, thinking that I had done it. Boo, indeed. It was not even worth taking the time to scoff at the idea. Ridiculous. So, why did it seem so familiar? I sighed and experienced one more new feeling: befuddlement. I simply had no notion of what was going on, except that somehow I was part of it. This did not seem a terribly helpful revelation, since it matched exactly all my other closely reasoned analytic conclusions so far. If I ruled out the absurd idea that I had done this without knowing, and I did, then each subsequent explanation became even more unlikely. And so Dexter's summary of the case reads as follows. He is involved somehow, but doesn't even know what that means. I could feel the little wheels in my once proud brain leaping off their tracks and clattering onto the floor. Clang, clang. Whee! Dexter derailed. Luckily, I was saved from complete collapse by the appearance of dear Deborah. Come on, she said brusquely. We're going upstairs. May I ask why? We're going to talk to the office staff, she said. See if they know anything. She looked at me for a moment and then turned away. Come on, she said. It may have been the commanding tone in her voice, but I went. We walked to the far side of the room, of the arena, from where I had been sitting into the lobby. A Broward cop stood beside the elevator there, and just outside the long row of glass doors, I could see several more of them standing at the barrier. Deb marched up to the cop and stepped up to the cop at the elevator and said, I'm Morgan. He nodded and pushed the up button. He looked at me with a lack of expression that said a great deal. I'm Morgan too, I told him. He just looked at me and then turned his head away to stare out the glass doors. There was a muted chime and the elevator arrived. Deborah stalked and slammed her hand against the button hard enough to make the cop look up at her, and the door slid shut. Why so glum, sis? I asked her. And isn't this what you wanted to do? It's make work, and everybody knows it, she snarled. But it's detective-type make work, I pointed out. That bitch LaGuardia stuck in her oar in, she hissed. As soon as I'm done spinning on my wheels here, I'm gonna have to go back out on hooker duty. Oh dear, in your little sex suit? In my little sex suit, she said. And before I could really formulate any magical words of consolation, we arrived at the office level and the elevator doors slid open. Deb stalked out, and I followed. We soon found the staff lounge where the office workers had been herded to wait until the full majesty of the law had gotten time to get around to them. Another Broward cop stood at the door of the lounge, presumably to make certain that none of the staff made a break for the Canadian border. Deborah nodded to the cop at the door and went into the lounge. I trailed behind her without much enthusiasm and let my mind wander over my problem. A moment later, I was startled out of my reverie when Deborah jerked her head at me and led a surly, greasy-faced young man with a young, long, and awful hair toward the door. I followed again. She was naturally separating him from the others for questioning. Very good police procedure, but to be perfectly honest, it did not light a fire in my heart. I knew without knowing why that none of these people had any meaningful thing to contribute. Judging from this first specimen, it was probably safe to apply that generalization to his life as well as to this murder. This was just dull routine make-work that had been doled out to Deb because the captain thought she had done something good, but she was still a pest. So he had sent her away with a piece of real detective drudgery to keep her busy and out of sight. And I had to beep, and I had been dragged with her because Deb wanted me alone. Possibly, she wanted to see if my fantastic ESP powers could determine what these office sheep had eaten for breakfast. One look at this young gentleman's complexion, and I was fairly sure he had eaten cold pizza, potato chips, and a liter of Pepsi. It had ruined his complexion and had given him an air of vacuous hostility. Still, I followed along as Mr. Grumpy directed Deborah to a conference room at the back of the building. There was a long oak table with 10 black high-backed chairs in the center of the room and a desk in the corner with a computer and some audio-visual equipment. As Deb and her pimply young friend began trading frowns, I wandered over to the desk. A small bookshelf sat under the window beside the desk. I looked out the window. Almost directly below me, I could see the growing crowd of reporters and the squad cars that now surrounded the door where we had gone in with Staban. I looked at the bookshelf, thinking I would clear a small space and lean there, tastefully, away from the conversation. There was a stack of manila folders, and they were perched on top of this small gray object. It was squarish and looked to be plastic. A black wire ran from the thing over back to the computer. I picked it up to move it. "Hey," the surly Geek said, "don't mess with the webcam." I looked at Deb. She looked at me, and I swear I saw her nostrils flare like a racehorse at a starting gate. "The what?" she said quietly. I had it focused down to the entrance. He said, "No, I gotta refocus it, man. Why do you have to mess with my stuff?" He said, "A webcam." I said, Deborah. "A camera," she said to me. "Yes." She turned to young Prince Charming. "Is it on?" He gaped at her, still concentrating on maintaining his righteous frown. "What?" "The camera," Deborah said. "Does it work?" He snorted, and then he wiped his nose with a finger. "What do you think? I would get all worked up if it didn't? $200? It totally works." I looked up at the window where the camera had been pointing, and as he droned in his surly grumble, "I got a website and everything. cathouse.com with a K. People can watch the team when they get here and when they leave." Deborah drifted over and stood beside me, looking out the window. "It was pointed out the door," I said. "Duh," our happy pal said. "How else are people on my website going to see the team?" Deborah turned and looked at him. After about 5 seconds, he blushed and dropped his eyes to catch the table. "Was the camera turned on last night?" she said. He didn't look up, just mumbled, "Sure. I guess so." Deborah turned to me. Her computer knowledge was confined to knowing enough about filling out standardized traffic reports. She knew I was a little more savvy. "How do you have it set up? I asked the top young, bleh. How do you have it set up? I asked the top of the young man's head. Do the images automatically archive? This time, he looked up. I had to use the archive as a verb, so I must be okay. Yeah, he said. It refreshes every 15 seconds and just dumps to the hard drive. I usually erase everything in the morning. Deborah actually clutched my arm hard enough to break the skin. Did you erase this morning? She asked him. He glanced away. No, he said. You guys came stomping in and yelling and stuff. I didn't even get to check my email. Deborah looked at me. Bingo, I said. Come here, she said to our unhappy camper. Huh? He said. Come here, she repeated, and he stood up slowly, mouth hanging open and rubbing his knuckles. What? He said. Could you please come over here, sir? Deborah ordered, with truly veteran cop techniques, and he stuttered into a motion and came over. Can we see the pictures from last night, please? He gaped at the computer, then at her. Why? He said. The mysteries of human intelligence. Because, Deborah said, very slowly and carefully, I think you might have taken a picture of the killer. He stared at her and blinked, then blushed. No way, he said. Way, I told him. He stared at me, then Deb, and his jaw hanging open. Awesome, he breathed. No shit. No really. He blushed even harder. Can we look at the pictures? Deborah said. He stood for a second, then plunged into the chair at the desk and touched the mouse. Immediately, the screen came to life and he began typing and mouse clicking furiously. What time should I start? What time did everybody leave? Deborah asked him. He shrugged. We were empty last night. Everybody gone by, 8 o'clock? Started at midnight, I said, and he nodded. Okay, he said. He worked quietly for a moment, then, come on, he mumbled. It's only like 600 megahertz, he said. They won't update. They're saying it's fine, but it's so freaking slow and it won't. Okay, he said, breaking off suddenly. A dark image appeared on the monitor in the empty parking lot below us. Midnight, he said, and stared at the screen. After 15 seconds, the picture changed to the same picture. Do we have to watch 5 hours of this? Deborah asked. Scroll through, I said. Look for the headlights or something moving. Right, he said. He did some rapid point and click, and the pictures began to flip past at 1 per second. They didn't change much at first, but the same dark parking lot once had a bright light on the edge of the picture. After about 50 frames had clicked past, an image now came into view. A truck, Deborah said. Our pet nerd shook his head. Security, he said. And in the next frame of the security car was visible. He kept scrolling, and the pictures rolled by, eternal and unchanging. Every 30 or 40 frames, we would see the security truck pass, and then nothing. After several minutes of this, the pattern stopped, and there was a long stretch of nothing. Busted, my greasy new friend said. Deborah gave him a hard look. The camera's broken? He looked up at her, blushed again, and looked away. The security dudes? He explained. They totally suck. Every night at 3, they park over at the other side and go to sleep. He nodded, and the unchanging pictures kept scrolling past. See? Hello, Mr. Security Dude. Hard at work? He made a wet sound deep in his snorting sound and started the picture scrolling again. Security Dude. And then suddenly, wait, I called out. On screen, a van popped into view. At the door below us, there was another pop-up at the image as the image changed, and a man stood beside the truck. Can you make it go closer? Deborah asked. Zoom in, I said before he could do more than frown a little. He moved the cursor, highlighted the dark figure on the screen, and clicked on the mouse. The picture jumped back to a closer look. You're not going to get much more resolution, he said. The pixels. Shut up, said Deborah. She was staring at the screen hard enough to melt it, and as I stared, I could, too, see why. It was dark, and the man was still too far away to be certain, but from the few details I could make out, there was something oddly familiar about him. The way he stood frozen in the image, on the computer, his weight balanced on both feet, and the overall impression of the profile. Somehow, as vague as it was, it added up to something, and as a very loud wave of sibilant chuckling erupted deep in the back seat of my brain, it fell on me with the impact of a concert of a grand piano that, actually, he looked like an awful lot like... Dexter? Deborah said, in a snort of hushed and strangled croak. Yes, indeed. Just like Dexter.